They told me it would be subtle, that nothing about me would really change, and that light echoes the loudest now as I stand in front of the mirror with my breath caught halfway between panic and wonder. I remember the exact second everything began to tilt, like the world quietly loosening a screw I didn't know was holding me together. It was an ordinary evening, gray with rainlight, my apartment humming with the sound of the fridge, and my own thoughts circling the same tired arguments. I had spent years negotiating with myself, bargaining in half sentences and reflections caught in dark windows. I told myself I just admired femininity, that curiosity didn't mean anything, that clothes were just fabric and names were just sounds. Those were safe explanations. They fit neatly into a life where I didn't have to ask harder questions. But that night, something felt unfinished. I opened the box I'd shoved to the back of my closet months earlier, the one I pretended was full of old cables and forgotten notebooks. My hands shook as if they already knew the truth before my mind would allow it. Inside were soft colors, lighter than anything else I owned, folded with care that felt almost ceremonial. I told myself I was only looking. I told myself I could stop anytime. The lies were gentle, almost loving, and that made them dangerous. When the fabric brushed my skin, I expected embarrassment, maybe a laugh at myself. Instead, there was a quiet click inside me, like a door aligning with its frame. I didn't feel transformed. I felt recognized. The mirror reflected someone unfamiliar but not wrong, and that distinction unsettled me more than fear ever could. My shoulders looked the same. My face still carried the angles I'd always known, yet my posture softened without instruction. It was as if my body understood a language my brain had been refusing to learn. The days that followed were filled with small, impossible moments. My reflection began to surprise me, not because it was changing fast, but because it was changing honestly. I caught myself practicing expressions without realizing it, testing smiles that felt warmer, eyes that lingered longer. My voice, when I spoke aloud to no one, dipped and rose in patterns I didn't remember choosing. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself stress could do strange stuff. But imagination doesn't leave fingerprints on your sense of self. When I finally decided to step outside like that, even just for a walk around the block, the air felt heavier, charged with meaning. Every footstep was a question mark. I kept waiting for laughter, for pointing fingers, for the world to snap back into cruelty. Instead, there was only the ordinary chaos of people living their lives, and in that indifference I felt something loosen in my chest. A stranger held the door open and smiled without hesitation, and the simplicity of that kindness nearly undid me. It wasn't approval I felt, it was permission. Still, the tension followed me home. Late at night, I'd sit on the edge of my bed, cataloging every perceived change, every shift in how I moved or thought. My emotions seemed closer to the surface now, like the volume had been turned up on colors I'd muted for years. I cried at a song on the radio and then laughed at myself for crying, then cried again because the laughter felt like a goodbye. I was grieving someone who hadn't disappeared, only stepped aside. The mirror became both ally and adversary. Some mornings I saw promise, a softness emerging in places I'd always fought. Other days I saw only confusion, a collage of old and new that didn't quite settle. Friends noticed something, though they couldn't name it. "You seem lighter," one of them said, and the word landed harder than she knew. Lighter meant less armored. Lighter meant closer to the truth. And then came the curves. They told me it would be barely noticeable, that my body would adjust in ways only I would see. But bodies don't keep secrets well. The first time I realized my silhouette had shifted, it felt like the floor dipped beneath me. My clothes fell differently, my balance changed, and my shadow on the wall looked like it belonged to someone braver. I pressed my palms against my sides, grounding myself, whispering that this was real, that I was still here. Fear didn't vanish, it evolved. It asked smarter questions. What if this cost me things I loved? What if the world's kindness was temporary? What if I was wrong? But alongside the fear grew a steadier voice, one that spoke less often and meant more when it did. It reminded me of all the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit a shape that never fit back. It reminded me that curiosity doesn't persist for decades unless it's pointing somewhere important. That night, standing again in front of the mirror, I finally let myself meet my own eyes without flinching. I didn't see a mistake. I saw motion, becoming, a story that hadn't reached its turning point yet. My heart hammered like it was chasing me towards something instead of away from it, and for the first time, I didn't slow down. I didn't know then how much more would change or how much stronger the storms would get, but I felt it coming, rolling toward me with a mix of terror and relief. They lied about how big the curves would be, yes, but more than that, they lied about how big I would have to become inside to carry them. The next morning arrived without ceremony, which somehow made it more intense, like the universe refusing to acknowledge that anything monumental was happening while my insides rearranged themselves anyway. I woke up already aware of my body, not in a dramatic way, but with a quiet attentiveness I'd never had before, as if I'd been upgraded with a new sense overnight. The sheets felt different against my skin, and when I sat up, my center of gravity argued with me for a second, just long enough to make my heart skip. I laughed under my breath, a soft, disbelieving sound, because even that laugh felt unfamiliar in a way that didn't scare me. I spent longer than usual getting ready, not out of vanity, but out of caution. Every movement felt like a negotiation between who I'd been and who I was becoming. My reflection greeted me like a stranger who knew my secrets, and I found myself studying details I'd never lingered on before. The curve of my neck when I tilted my head, the way my shoulders relaxed when I stopped forcing them back. There was a tenderness in my expression that startled me. I hadn't practiced it. It had simply shown up. Leaving the apartment felt like stepping into a test I hadn't studied for. The hallways seemed narrower, the elevator mirrors more honest than I wanted them to be. I kept expecting someone to call me out, to name the change, to make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Instead, there was only the mundane choreography of shared spaces, polite nods, eyes sliding past, the soft ding of the elevator announcing floors that didn't care about my internal revolution. Outside, the city looked sharper, louder, more saturated. I noticed things I used to ignore, reflections in windows, the rhythm of footsteps, the way people occupied their bodies with such unthinking confidence. I wondered how many of them had ever felt this exposed, this vividly present in their own skin. The thought made me feel less alone, and more fragile at the same time. At work, the tension followed me like a low electrical hum. My clothes fit just differently enough to keep me aware of myself every second, like a gentle but persistent reminder tapping on my shoulder. I caught colleagues glancing at me with curiosity they probably didn't realize they were showing. No one said anything outright, but conversations hesitated, then resumed with a carefulness that told me something was registering. I smiled more than usual, not to deflect suspicion, but because it felt like the right response to uncertainty. Smiling felt like choosing openness over armor. There was a moment in the restroom, standing alone with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when the reality of it all pressed down on me. I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly, my reflection fragmented by the mirror's seams. Fear crept in then, sharp and articulate. It asked me what I thought I was doing, who I thought I was fooling, how I planned to explain myself when explanations were demanded. I answered it silently, not with logic, but with memory. I remembered the weight I'd carried for years, the constant self-surveillance, the exhaustion of pretending curiosity was harmless and temporary. I remembered how light had felt the night before, and that memory steadied me. The changes didn't stop at the surface. My thoughts began to rearrange themselves, too, forming patterns that felt more fluid, less rigidly defended. I found myself responding to stress with reflection instead of reflex, pausing where I used to charge ahead. Emotions surfaced faster now, but they also passed through me more cleanly, like weather instead of earthquakes. It was disorienting and oddly empowering, learning that sensitivity didn't mean weakness, that feeling deeply could be a kind of strength. Later that week, I met a friend for coffee, someone who'd known me long enough to notice even the subtlest shifts. She tilted her head as soon as she saw me, her eyes narrowing with affectionate scrutiny. "There's something different about you," she said, not accusing, just curious. My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could hear it. I considered deflecting, joking, changing the subject. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let the moment breathe. "I think I'm finally listening to myself," I said. The words surprised us both. She smiled, a real one, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. The warmth of that simple gesture nearly undid me. That evening, alone again, I stood in front of the mirror and really looked. The curves were undeniable now, not exaggerated, not caricatured, but present in a way that demanded acknowledgement. They changed how I occupied space, how I balanced, how I thought about myself in relation to the world. I traced the outline of my silhouette in the glass without touching it, as if I might smudge the truth. Instead of panic, I felt a slow, spreading awe. My body was telling a story my words had been afraid to tell. Yet doubt lingered, stubborn as ever. I worried about labels, about expectations snapping into place the moment I claimed anything out loud. I worried about losing the right to change my mind. But beneath those worries was a growing certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't a phase or a costume. It was a process, one that required patience and courage in equal measure. I didn't need to have all the answers yet. I just needed to keep moving toward honesty. As I lay in bed that night, the city's distant sounds drifting through the window, I felt both smaller and larger than I ever had. Smaller because I was acutely aware of my vulnerability, larger because I was finally making room for all of myself. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in questions and quiet hope, and as I drifted off, I sensed that the hardest parts were still ahead, waiting with lessons I couldn't yet imagine. The following days slipped into one another like frames of a film running just a little too fast, and yet every moment felt hyperreal, weighted with discovery and unease. I began noticing changes not just in the mirror, but in the way the world responded to me, in the way I moved, in the tiny recalibrations of identity that demanded attention with every breath. The curves I had been warned about, or rather, reassured wouldn't be that pronounced, were now undeniable. They didn't just alter my appearance. They demanded a new rhythm for my body, a new gravity that I had to learn to inhabit. Walking down the street felt like recalculating my center of mass with every step, as if my body and the pavement were negotiating a treaty I had never anticipated. I bought new clothes, tentative at first, then with a growing hunger. Fabrics, cuts, colors I'd once admired from a safe distance now beckoned, each piece a tiny act of courage. Shopping alone was a sensory explosion, mirrors catching reflections I had only glimpsed in private, hangers heavy with promise, the quiet judgment of my own internalized fears. I touched soft skirts and felt my heartbeat spike, my palms growing clammy with both anticipation and shame. And yet I couldn't stop. There was an undeniable thrill in the intimacy of choice, in selecting what fit me not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. It was a reclamation of sorts, a quiet declaration that my body was mine to explore, mine to dress, mine to witness. The tension wasn't just internal. Strangers' glances sometimes flickered longer than expected, polite smiles occasionally lingering a fraction too long, and I caught myself bracing for judgment that never came. Social interactions became a game of micro-moments, each one a test of authenticity versus performance. At a cafe, I overheard snippets of conversation, ordinary chatter that somehow felt like commentary on me, and I realized how attuned I had become to subtle cues I would have previously ignored. I felt simultaneously hypervisible and invisible, a paradox that left me dizzy and exhilarated. Work became its own crucible. I couldn't pretend to be the same person, not when the lines of my face softened and my posture shifted without conscious effort. Meetings felt strange. My voice carried differently, lighter but no less sure, and the way colleagues responded, polite, sometimes puzzled, sometimes admiring, forced me to confront my own assumptions. Was I overthinking everything, or had I finally noticed what had been there all along? My internal dialogue became relentless. Who am I if no one else's rules apply? How much of me is performance, and how much is truth? One evening, I ventured further than I had before, stepping into a part of the city I usually avoided. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and reshape me, exaggerating curves I was only beginning to understand. I paused in front of a window, staring at my reflection. The familiar angle softened, the lines of my face shifting subtly with emotion, the way light caught my hair and shoulders, creating a portrait of someone simultaneously new and eternally me. I felt a tremor of recognition. My own gaze felt like an embrace, or at least the beginning of one. I ran my hands along my sides, over the subtle swell of hips I had once thought would never exist, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. I simply acknowledged. The internal tension became physical. Nights were restless. Dreams blurred into waking life with a fluidity that left me questioning everything I thought I knew. I would wake in the dark, heart pounding, and stare at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, my own body, thinking, this is happening. This is really happening. I learned to sit with that uncertainty instead of fleeing from it, and in doing so, discovered a strange serenity, a clarity I hadn't expected. The mirror, once a source of anxiety, became a confidant. I would talk to myself aloud sometimes, whispering words of reassurance, testing phrases of affirmation until they sounded believable, until they were believable. And then came the most difficult moments, friends and family noticing, commenting, questioning. Not everyone was gentle. Some words landed like pebbles, others like stones, but even the stinging ones held a mirror to my resilience. I learned quickly which conversations to navigate with patience, which to hold at a distance, and which required the courage to lay my truth bare. The emotional landscape was jagged, the peaks exhilarating, the valleys raw. I often found myself alone afterward, replaying interactions, analyzing every inflection, every glance, every gesture, until the apartment felt both like sanctuary and crucible. Through it all, there were surprises. Moments of tenderness that I hadn't anticipated. Strangers whose kindness didn't feel performative, friends whose curiosity was genuine, reflections that told me I was braver than I'd realized. I discovered joy in small victories, a new skirt fitting perfectly, a braid holding just right, a smile that didn't feel forced. And yet, even in triumph, the doubt lingered. The weight of who I had been versus who I was becoming, the constant calculation of space, perception, and identity. One night, after hours of pacing and reflection, I returned to my apartment and stood in front of the mirror, tracing the contours of my body like a cartographer mapping new territory. The transformation wasn't just visible, it was psychological, emotional, spiritual. Every curve, every line, every softening of angles told a story of acceptance and discovery, a narrative I had been writing for years without acknowledging it. The realization hit me in a rush. I wasn't just becoming someone else. I was becoming more me than I had ever allowed myself to be. And yet, just as awe surged, a flicker of fear followed. What if this visibility came at a cost I hadn't anticipated? What if the world's indifference turned into scrutiny? What if I faltered? The tension between exhilaration and anxiety became a constant companion, shaping every decision, every movement, every thought. It was a tightrope walk with no safety net, and for the first time, I understood the courage of simply existing in the skin that felt right. By the end of that week, I no longer flinched when I looked in the mirror. I studied myself with careful fascination, tracing the arc of curves that had been underestimated, relishing in the fullness of what had been promised only partially. They had lied about the size, yes, but the lie illuminated something larger. That transformation wasn't measured merely in centimeters or clothes, but in the audacity of claiming one's own body, one's own presence, one's own narrative. I stood there for hours, just looking, breathing, naming the shifts that weren't just physical, but existential. And in that quiet communion, I felt something undeniable. The world could stare, question, doubt, or ignore, and it would not matter. Because the story had already begun, unfolding inside me with a momentum that could not be stopped. I was becoming, and in that becoming, I was infinite. The mornings grew both brighter and heavier, like the sun itself was pressuring me to recognize the change in full daylight. I started to notice subtle differences in my reflection before I even opened my eyes. The way my shoulders sloped differently, how my hips seemed to hold a new rhythm even under pajama fabric, the way my chest rose and fell with an unfamiliar softness. Each small change was like a drumbeat, a reminder that my body was telling its own story, one that demanded acknowledgement even if my mind still argued. There was an intimacy in that recognition that I had never experienced before, the feeling of watching someone evolve in real time, someone who had been hidden in plain sight. Work had become a nuanced battlefield. I wasn't seeking approval, but I was constantly aware of perception. Each email I sent, each presentation I gave, was weighed in a new way. Colleagues offered glances that I could no longer ignore, and I sometimes caught the quick, startled recognition that perhaps this was a person they thought they knew, now revealed differently. Some of it was curiosity, some admiration, some confusion, and every fraction of those reactions carved their way into my consciousness. I felt exposed, but not in a cruel way, more like standing in the sun after years in shadow. The light burned, yes, but it also revealed what had always been there. At home, the mirror became my confidant, my canvas, my battlefield. I spent hours tracing lines with my fingertips, adjusting hairstyles, testing clothes, practicing movements I hadn't realized I'd been avoiding. I discovered a strange fascination with gestures, the subtle tilt of my head, the curve of my hand. I learned how to walk differently, more deliberately, letting the sway of my hips feel natural instead of self-conscious. There was a rhythm and movement I had always sensed but never trusted, and now it hummed quietly beneath my skin, urging me forward, coaxing me into embodiment. One night, I went out for a walk with no particular destination, letting the city guide me. Streetlights threw halos on wet sidewalks, and reflections shimmered in puddles like fragments of a world I was only beginning to inhabit. People passed by, and I watched their faces for recognition, for judgment, for understanding, and mostly I found indifference. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. The world's gaze did not control me. I did. And as I passed a mirror-like window, catching a glimpse of my reflection mid-step, I was startled not by my body, but by the way my posture carried something entirely new. Presence. Confidence, not arrogant, not forced, but simply existing as truth. The inner conflict never fully left me. Fear still lingered in corners, whispering doubts, sometimes loudly. What if they notice too much? What if your friends pull back? What if you step into a space you can't reclaim? But alongside the fear, a quiet determination emerged. It told me that curiosity was a form of courage, that vulnerability was a doorway to authenticity, and that the life I had been living in fragments and shadows was no longer sufficient. Friends became a mixed tapestry of challenge and comfort. Some celebrated quietly, offering compliments that felt like tiny victories. Some stumbled awkwardly, uncertain how to acknowledge the shift without offending or overstepping. There were moments of confrontation, too, questions posed directly, sometimes brusque, sometimes hesitant. "Are you sure?" one friend asked. The honesty in her voice was less judgment than bewilderment, but it stung nonetheless. I realized that this journey wasn't just internal, it was relational, and every step forward required recalibration of trust, patience, and transparency. I had to learn not only to accept myself, but to navigate the reactions of others without losing my footing. Shopping trips became exercises in self-awareness and experimentation. Fabrics that I had never dared touch felt like invitations. Hangers carried new possibilities, and dressing rooms became laboratories of identity. I'd step in, adjust the lighting, and study the reflection critically yet tenderly. Every curve, every line, every angle felt like evidence of a truth I had been ignoring. I experimented with colors I never imagined wearing, soft pastels that brought warmth to my complexion, delicate patterns that moved with my body. There was a quiet ecstasy in discovering how fabric could accentuate not just my shape, but my sense of self. But perhaps the most profound moments were the quiet, solitary ones. Nights when the city was asleep, and I was left only with my reflection and my thoughts. I would run my fingers along my hips, trace the line of my collarbone, adjust the fall of a skirt, and simply breathe. These were intimate, almost ritualistic acts of recognition and acceptance. I spoke to myself in whispers, naming fears, tracing triumphs, exploring the terrain of a self that had been waiting decades for acknowledgement. There were tears, sometimes, not of sadness, but of release, a profound exhalation of suppressed longing finally given form. It was during one of these nights that I realized the magnitude of the journey. The curves, the posture, the style, the subtle sway of my movements, they were not just surface changes. They were evidence of transformation at a fundamental level. My thoughts felt lighter yet sharper, my emotional palette richer, more immediate. I was no longer a passive observer of life. I was an active participant, fully embodied, fully present, and frighteningly, beautifully visible. And yet, even in awe, the doubt persisted. I worried about missteps, about moments of vulnerability being misinterpreted, about the potential consequences of being so unmistakably seen. But in that very tension, I discovered a paradox. The fear was not a signal to retreat, but a confirmation that I was stretching into something real. I was walking a line between comfort and exposure, and the act of walking it, of simply continuing, was itself an affirmation. By the time I finally slid into bed, exhaustion hit like a wave, but beneath it, an unshakable hum of vitality. The reflection in my mind's eye lingered: curves, posture, softness, strength, presence, identity. I had begun to inhabit a self that was no longer negotiable, no longer fragmented, no longer constrained by half-truths or polite denials. I was becoming fully visible, fully acknowledged, fully alive, and the journey, terrifying and exhilarating, was only accelerating. Days blended into one another with a new kind of intensity, each morning a subtle confrontation with myself. I would wake, feel the curves that had grown more pronounced with time, the soft sway of my hips, the gentle rise and fall of my chest, and the thrill of recognition would surge through me before I even opened my eyes. I was learning, slowly and insistently, to inhabit this body with the ease I had once denied myself. Every movement, every gesture, became a negotiation, sometimes clumsy, sometimes elegant, but always charged with awareness. I caught myself adjusting my posture without thinking, shifting my weight to find balance, letting my hands brush along my sides as if they were mapping uncharted territory. Going out into the world became both a liberation and a challenge. The city felt different now. It was not that the buildings or the streets had changed, but that I had. Sidewalks seemed to demand a different rhythm, the turns of street corners a heightened awareness of presence. I noticed how people responded, small glances, fleeting smiles, subtle shifts in conversation, and though no one said anything explicit, every interaction felt magnified. There were moments of anxiety, of course. A passerby's glance would linger a moment too long, and I would feel a jolt of fear, a reminder that visibility was a double-edged sword. Yet alongside that fear was a quiet exhilaration. I was being seen, fully and unmistakably, and even in that scrutiny, there was power. Work became a delicate balancing act. Emails, meetings, even casual conversations now carried an undercurrent I had not anticipated. Colleagues noticed the subtle changes, how my voice carried differently, how my gestures were softer, more deliberate, more expressive. There were questions, indirect and tentative, about whether I was experimenting, trying something new, exploring identity, and I realized that every interaction required both honesty and tact. I learned to navigate these moments with care, letting my presence speak without over-explaining, asserting my identity without demanding it be named. It was exhausting, yet deeply rewarding, a constant test of confidence, patience, and self-trust. Shopping trips became elaborate rituals of self-discovery. Fabrics I had once dismissed now invited touch. Colors I had avoided suddenly felt magnetic. I spent hours in dressing rooms, adjusting skirts, tracing lines of seams, testing silhouettes against mirrors that reflected both curiosity and awe. There was a sensuality to it, not sexual, but an awareness of texture, weight, shape, and movement. I experimented with layers, with draping, with subtle accessories that accentuated my emerging identity. Each small triumph, a skirt that fit perfectly, a blouse that moved with my body, was a declaration. I belonged in this skin, in this body, in this expression of self. Evenings were the most profound. Alone in my apartment, I would stand before the mirror for what felt like hours, exploring the new contours of my body, the gentle curves that had been underestimated, the angles that softened with time, the movements that now felt instinctive. I whispered affirmations to myself, naming fears, recognizing victories, embracing the unknown. Tears came often, sometimes without warning, not from sadness, but from relief. The relief of finally meeting myself without compromise. The room seemed to shrink to just me and my reflection, and in that intimacy, I felt both fragile and indomitable. Friends noticed the change, of course. Some approached with care, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Others hesitated, unsure how to respond without offense or overstepping. I learned to navigate these responses with patience, understanding that their reactions were mirrors of their own experiences, not judgments of mine. One friend asked quietly, "Are you happy?" And the simplicity of the question made my heart ache. I realized that happiness was no longer a theoretical concept. It was palpable, measurable in the way I moved, the way I breathed, the way I carried myself through space. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of truth settle. Yes, I was happy, more fully than I had ever allowed myself to be. The transformation was not just external. Thoughts, emotions, perceptions, these evolved too. I felt more attuned to subtle moods, both my own and others, more present in conversations, more willing to pause, to reflect, to respond rather than react. Sensitivity no longer felt like a weakness. It felt like strength, a bridge between self and world. I discovered empathy in new dimensions, seeing patterns and feelings I had once overlooked. My emotional landscape was richer, more complex, yet lighter, freer, unencumbered by the rigid defenses I had built over decades. Late at night, I often returned to the mirror, tracing the journey etched in my body's curves, my posture, the gentle swell of flesh that had once been denied, the soft angles that now defined me. I whispered my own name, testing the sound, tasting it on my tongue, letting it sink into my bones. I practiced walks, gestures, tilts of my head, learning the cadence of presence, of ownership, of freedom. Every evening ended with a quiet reverence for the self I was discovering, the identity I was claiming, the courage I had cultivated in the smallest, quietest moments. And yet, doubt lingered, like shadows in corners. What if visibility came with cost I hadn't anticipated? What if the world's indifference shifted to scrutiny? What if my own confidence faltered? But I learned to sit with doubt as I had learned to sit with joy, not as a barrier, but as a companion, a reminder that growth is never linear, that transformation requires both exhilaration and discomfort, that true courage is the willingness to continue despite uncertainty. By the end of this week, I had become intimate with my reflection in ways I had never imagined possible. The curves, the posture, the newfound elegance, they were not just surface changes. They were markers of a deeper evolution, of a self emerging from layers of concealment, hesitation, and doubt. I was no longer hiding. I was no longer negotiating or compromising. I was fully, undeniably, unapologetically present. Standing there, in the quiet of my apartment, I traced my silhouette in the mirror one last time before bed, feeling the weight and lift of my body, the rhythm and sway that had been promised and exceeded. They had lied about the size of the curves, yes, but in doing so, they revealed something larger. That transformation is never just about the body. It is about courage, presence, recognition, and the audacious act of embracing oneself completely. The days that followed felt both ordinary and extraordinary, a strange duality that mirrored my internal transformation. Morning light fell differently now, catching the contours of my body in ways that made me pause before rising from bed. I traced the subtle swell of my hips, the gentle roundness of my chest, and the softened lines of my shoulders. Each reflection in the mirror was a dialogue, sometimes questioning, sometimes admiring, always intimate. I began to notice how my hair framed my face differently when I moved, how the sway of a skirt or the curve of a sleeve changed the rhythm of my step. The body I had inhabited for so long had been a silent observer of my life. Now it was active, expressive, undeniably present. I started to venture further into public spaces, testing boundaries, testing reactions, testing myself. The first subway ride after I began dressing more fully, in ways that reflected my transformation, felt like a small rebellion and a revelation at once. The hum of the train, the press of bodies, the snippets of conversations around me, all of it felt charged with significance. I was hyper-aware of every glance, every tone, every movement, and yet, paradoxically, I felt freer. There was a strange exhilaration in inhabiting space without apology, in letting my presence exist unshielded by pretense. It was terrifying, yes, but also intoxicating. Friends and coworkers noticed, some openly curious, some delicately hesitant. I had learned to answer questions honestly without oversharing, to let people witness the change without feeling entitled to it. One evening, after a long workday, a colleague asked me quietly if I had always been this confident. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I'm learning," I said.
And it was true.
Confidence wasn't a destination. It was an ongoing act, a negotiation with myself, a practice in showing up fully even when fear threatened to pull me back. That realization, confidence is action, not a trait, became my anchor. Shopping became more than just a pursuit of clothes. It became research, performance, meditation. I would wander racks slowly, testing textures, colors, patterns, and cuts, noting how fabric interacted with my form and my movement. I experimented with layering, with subtle accessories, with shoes that altered posture and gait. Each successful choice, a skirt that flattered, a blouse that hung perfectly, a pair of shoes that fit both body and mood, felt like a triumph, evidence that my external reality could match my internal identity. And each minor failure, a garment that didn't fit, a color that felt wrong, was equally instructive, teaching patience, resilience, and the value of experimentation. Evenings were reserved for reflection, for intimacy with myself in the quiet of my apartment. I would stand before the mirror, slowly tracing my body with my eyes and fingertips, whispering affirmations and reminders. You are enough. You are whole. You are present. Sometimes I cried, not from sorrow but from recognition, from the profound relief of meeting myself fully for the first time. Other nights, I practiced movement, tilting my head, adjusting posture, walking in front of the mirror, until gestures that once felt foreign became familiar, fluid, instinctive. These rituals were not vanity. They were reclamation, an embodied rehearsal of existence in the skin that finally felt mine. And yet, doubt lingered. I worried, sometimes, about how much of this visibility I could sustain, how much scrutiny I could endure. I questioned whether friends truly understood, whether strangers' glances carried judgment, whether I would falter under expectation. But each fear became a challenge to meet with honesty, each hesitation a chance to practice courage. I realized that transformation was not linear, that growth required both exhilaration and discomfort, and that true presence demanded embracing both. One night, I ventured out late, drawn to a quiet park illuminated by lamplight. The air was cool, the leaves whispered in the breeze, and I walked slowly, deliberately, letting my new rhythm find its natural cadence. Passing a small pond, I stopped, catching my reflection in the water, fragmented and wavering. I studied the curve of my silhouette, the gentle slope of my shoulders, the movement of my hair. And in that reflected, fluid image, I saw not just physical transformation but psychological and emotional evolution, a self no longer hiding, no longer apologizing, no longer constrained by old rules. The realization struck me fully. This journey was not about perfection or appearance or meeting expectations. It was about recognition, acknowledging every part of myself that had been suppressed, denied, or silenced. It was about presence, claiming space in the world, inhabiting it fully and unapologetically. It was about courage, the ongoing act of facing uncertainty with authenticity, vulnerability, and self-love. I was no longer merely existing. I was living fully, profoundly, beautifully alive. By the time I returned to my apartment, night had fully settled. I stood once more before the mirror, tracing the curves that had grown, the angles that had softened, the posture that had shifted. I let myself breathe deeply, inhaling both relief and exhilaration. I whispered softly, almost reverently, "This is me." And in that declaration, I felt a kind of peace I had never known, the unshakable knowledge that the journey, with all its twists, doubts, and triumphs, was leading me not just to who I was becoming, but to the full recognition of who I had always been. The morning after that quiet night in the park, I woke with a sense of momentum I hadn't felt before. Sunlight pooled across the floor, catching my hair, glinting off the soft lines of my face, tracing the curves I was still learning to inhabit. I lingered in bed for a long time, feeling the weight and lift of my body, the subtle sway of hips, the gentle rise of my chest. I realized I no longer approached the mirror with trepidation. Instead, it had become a witness, a companion, a participant in my daily ritual of self-discovery. I studied my reflection, noting how my body moved naturally now, unself-consciously, how my posture carried a quiet dignity, how the angles and curves blended into a harmony I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. The days that followed were both ordinary and extraordinary. I navigated the world with a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity that made every glance, every word, every gesture feel significant. The city, once indifferent and imposing, now felt alive in ways I had never appreciated. The hum of cars, the rhythm of footsteps, the faint laughter of strangers, all of it became part of a subtle symphony in which I was no longer just an observer. I moved with intention, letting the sway of my hips, the tilt of my shoulders, the natural cadence of my walk express a confidence that had once been unimaginable. Work, too, had changed. Colleagues noticed more than they realized. Some commented gently, complimenting choices of clothing or demeanor. Others observed quietly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. I learned to navigate these reactions with grace, offering honesty without over-explaining, asserting presence without defensiveness. Each interaction became a delicate balance between authenticity and patience, between vulnerability and self-assurance. I discovered a new kind of power in simply existing without apology, in letting my presence communicate what words could not. Shopping excursions evolved into acts of both exploration and ritual. I wandered stores slowly, testing fabrics, colors, and cuts with careful attention, noting how each garment interacted with my form and my newfound movement. Dressing rooms became laboratories of identity, spaces where I could experiment freely, test expressions, and practice gestures. Each successful choice, a skirt that fit perfectly, a blouse that flowed naturally, shoes that altered posture and stride, felt like a small triumph. Even missteps, garments that clashed or fit awkwardly, were instructive, teaching me patience, adaptability, and the joy of experimentation. Evenings remained sacred. Alone in my apartment, I would stand before the mirror, tracing curves and angles with my eyes and hands, whispering affirmations that had once seemed impossible. You are whole. You are enough. You are present. Sometimes tears came, not from sadness, but from relief. The relief of finally inhabiting a self that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Other nights, I practiced movement, tilts of the head, the sway of my walk, gestures of the hands, until the once foreign motions became natural, instinctive, fluid. These acts, small and deliberate, were not vanity. They were reclamation, ritualized celebration of a self that was finally seen and acknowledged. Doubt, of course, lingered. Fear whispered in quiet corners, questioning whether visibility came at a cost, whether friends and strangers would understand, whether I could sustain this authenticity. But I had learned to sit with doubt as I sat with joy, as a companion rather than an enemy. Each hesitation, each moment of uncertainty, was a reminder that growth requires courage, that presence demands both vulnerability and resilience, that transformation is not a straight line but a tapestry of light and shadow. Late one night, I found myself wandering the city streets again, drawn by the quiet solitude of empty sidewalks. Streetlights glinted off wet pavement, reflecting fragments of myself in scattered mirrors of water. I walked slowly, deliberately, feeling the natural rhythm of my hips, the lift and fall of my chest, the sway of shoulders freed from old tension. Pausing in front of a window, I caught my reflection, a fragmented yet whole image, and realized that I no longer saw a body in conflict with itself. I saw someone fully inhabiting space, fully visible, fully acknowledged. Not perfect, not complete, but undeniably real. The final realization, the one that settled like sunlight in my chest, was this: transformation is never merely physical. It is emotional, psychological, spiritual. The curves, the sway, the posture, they were markers, yes, but markers of a deeper evolution. Every choice, every movement, every reflection was a negotiation between fear and courage, doubt and presence, concealment and authenticity. And through it all, I discovered something astonishing. The world's gaze mattered less than my own, the opinions of others less than my recognition of myself, the whispers of fear less than the declaration of truth. That night, I stood before the mirror one last time, tracing every line, every curve, every angle with reverence. I whispered softly, almost reverently, "This is me." And in that utterance, I felt a profound peace, a clarity I had never known. The journey, with all its twists, doubts, triumphs, and revelations, had led me here, not just to a body transformed, but to a self fully claimed, fully acknowledged, fully alive. I was no longer shrinking, no longer hiding, no longer negotiating or apologizing. I was present. I was real. I was infinite. And for the first time, I knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing could take that away.